Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, U.S. tech is in some serious trouble as there is now a two-edged sword of Beijing ordering Chinese companies from buying Nvidia chips. At the same time, Nvidia is hemorrhaging revenue because China isn't buying what they're selling.
Yeah, absolutely. And it gets a whole lot more complicated for the West than that. I mean, it's just back to this situation where the irony of all ironies was the United States went out of its way to ban Nvidia from selling chips to the Chinese to inhibit China's technological revolution, so to speak. And now the irony of ironies is the boot's on the other foot, and China's so-called Cyberspace Administration of China, which is their major internet regulator, has reportedly banned its biggest tech companies from buying Nvidia AI chips. So that ban comes just a matter of weeks, obviously, after the same companies were told to stop ordering Nvidia's H20 chips too. Now, why is Beijing doing this? I kind of have some sympathy for Nvidia because they are really caught between a rock and a hard place. They're not the problem in this equation. They were given orders by the United States, which, granted, some people will argue they could have defied and walked away from it, but they didn't. And so they end up paying a big price for this. But China's basically come out and said, look, our homegrown AI chip makers, like a Huawei, for example, can produce chips now that are comparable. They even argue could be better than Nvidia's, what are termed China-only products. So the question is, to what extent is that statement correct? Well, the fullness of time will demonstrate it to be true or not. But the argument is they must be comparable because China's not going to shoot itself in the foot and delay its own technological advancement on a matter of principle by going, well, we don't want these chips from Nvidia, which of course we could have ordered. They're not doing so because they have made their own advancements. And the other thing, of course, is there's Chinese tech giants want to build their own infrastructure as well. Therefore, Chinese chip makers are going to hugely ramp up production because they're anticipating there's going to be a lot of orders coming from companies that want AI chips but can't purchase Nvidia products that cost China, that is. So there's a big incentive for Chinese companies as well to be involved in putting the nuts and bolts in place to produce huge amounts of chips on the basis of that. And it's interesting, the CEO of Nvidia came out, Jensen Huang, and said, obviously he was disappointed what happened. He says, but they have larger agendas to work out between China and the US. I understand that. But he says we take a patient approach and will continue to be supportive of the Chinese government and Chinese companies as they wish. So they're hoping that, this isn't closing the door on Nvidia. Well, it isn't. It's only with regards to certain chipsets. But the question is, eventually, does it become a situation where the doors can close completely? And as you pointed out, Ken, they generate, what was it, 40% of their revenue from selling chips to China. So it's going to hit them, and it's going to hit them pretty hard. And this, of course, came after China accused Nvidia of breaking its anti-monopoly law, with them facing potentially fines of up to 10% of its Chinese revenue. We'll see what that comes to pass with regards to that. Sorry. So the question is, why is China doing this? Well, it's very obvious, and from I think both of our perspectives, that this is a move by Beijing to break free from having US technology to significantly boost its own semiconductor industry. And of course, the reasoning is self-explanatory because they can't trust the US to next week, next month, put more restrictions in place. So China's gone, well, we'll just invent our own. We'll create our own technology. We'll become self-sufficient. But you know what's going to happen in the end? China will corner the entire global south and sell all the technology to them. and that's going to be to the detriment of Western companies. So it's quite clear what the intentions are of the Chinese, I think. I mean, but the idea really that Nvidia is going to get a look back in the future, certainly not with regards to the chipsets that are banned, but it's absolutely all, hands to the pump for China to build an entire domestic ecosystem that serves all aspects, of course, of the semiconductor market.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I think one of the bottom lines in this is not only that China has, over the course of the last just couple years, really accelerated its manufacturing and innovation, but they've done so at, for all intents and purposes in the tech world, rock bottom prices. All we have to do is go look at DeepSeek. They were able to do with $6 million what all these other U.S. and Europe, well, Europe isn't even involved yet, but all these U.S. companies have invested tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars to try to do, and it barely was on equal footing with DeepSeek. And one of the important things with Nvidia is they came out with their new RTX 6000 AI chip, and the reason it's getting dismal demand is because it's too expensive. That is going to be America's biggest problem is the fact that everything that they produce now, because everything is inflated, is way beyond the scope of what you get for value. And so all you have to do also is look at the Chinese tech stock markets. Since the beginning of August, they have gone nearly straight up, and they're even bound for a breakthrough. While in the U.S. markets, they're at all-time highs, but they're not producing anything. All they are is just, you know, print, for all intents and purposes, printed money going into equities and creating inflated asset prices, while China is actually producing things, and for costs that nations are gonna look to China to buy. Nvidia is going to be on the wayside, and what's the West going to do? Because they are not going to have the capital. The capital is going to flow into China to do the next innovations, and the U.S. is going to have to do another trillion-dollar CHIPS Act to try to subsidize its own markets. And even then, they're not producing anything.
Yeah, it's a huge problem, and it's a bandwagon because, like China's Alibaba's developed this new chip that's a lot more versatile. It will serve a huge, broader range of AI inference tasks. But the big difference is it's now in testing. It's manufactured by a Chinese company. But earlier incarnations of Alibaba's AI chips were being fabricated by the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. Well, they're going to stop that. It's all in-house. We're in control of the whole process. We're going to be relying on homegrown technology. And this is, all the while that the United States is putting punishing restrictions on Nvidia in the process. I mean, so that's why you have to have sympathy for them as a company because, they were selling the H20 chip, the most powerful AI processor that it was allowed to sell because the Trump administration put them under restrictions. And that was blocked from sale in the market by the Trump administration. They panicked and suddenly revoked it. And they said you can sell them. And now, of course, Chinese firms are working on processors that are going to substitute H20s. And now China doesn't want them anymore. I mean, and bear in mind, NVIDIA developed that specifically for China because of US export restrictions put in place in 2023. And Alibaba is China's biggest cloud computing company. And what's the other thing? It's one of the major clients of NVIDIA. So this is a huge problem for the West or for NVIDIA. And China just keeps, the bandwagon going. And there are other developments going on, and which I'll come to in a minute. and that relates to lithography. And this is something we spoke about in the past, but this is a hot off the press development that's worth commenting on because it is a game changer in the making.
Yeah, I think something really important before we transition into the lithography is that the U.S. obviously around, you want to talk internet coming in 93, a lot of these social media platforms and other platforms in the 2000 to 2007, 2008 range. The U.S. definitely dominated that. So much so that, Europe has to do these spurious fines because they can't compete themselves technologically. But with that being said, when you have the creation of the Facebooks and the Twitter and all that, that was top of the line technology and innovation at that time. But what did these companies do? Instead of moving forward and increasing and finding new innovations, they simply bought other people's innovations and called it their own and acquired it. So America is getting to the point when it comes to technology, we do not have the wherewithal or the mindset to actually move forward in advance. And because China was cut out of the markets, whether for national security or for whatever other reason, they have been in this continuous innovation mode. So when it comes to as lithography is a great example. There's the global standard for lithography for making chips, and China found a new solution and a new way to do it that the West can't even compete with.
No, exactly. And this is relates to SMIC in China, who's began testing the first Chinese-made advanced AI chip making tool. Well, that's going to reduce their reliance on ASML. It'll reduce their reliance, of course, on the United States. And they're now testing this first advanced DUV lithography chip making equipment. And what's interesting about this equipment, it was actually made by a new startup company in Shanghai called Yuliang Sheng. And yeah, of course, that will overcome the US obstacles in chip supply, but it's going to boost the production of AI chips as well in China. And it depends on the immersion technology, just like ASML, but it's slightly different. And therefore, this enables this tool for printing smaller and more dense features on chips. So it's testing a 28 nanometer Chinese made DVU. People go, so what? Well, it's going to then utilize this what's called patterning techniques to produce 7 nanometer chip. And they're saying there's a very high chance they can produce 5 nanometer chip in the near future. Now, there was a time when if you'd said that to anyone in the world, they'd have gone, China's a decade away from that, maybe 20 years, maybe never. China's done it in record time. I mean, and there are also suggestions that there's an attempt by SMIC in testing the first Chinese made AI chip making tool could help Huawei use a 5 nanometer chip in its new phones when next year, and not the back end of next year. So you could be talking 6 to 9 months. There are claims that the early results from trials are very promising. So that machinery, like in China, if it does its job, it just gets rolled out. There's none of this, let's wait 5 years till we do this. And of course, the components used in the equipment are Chinese made. So the question is, when is it going to enter into mass production? That's a great question. But if it all comes to pass by next year, then, that will be a huge step forward for Chinese companies, which can obviously utilize this advanced machinery. And because SMIC and other Chinese chip making companies have to rely on ASML or have had to rely on Nvidia chips, well, we've just spoken about what's happening with Nvidia. And now this obviously means they're not reliant on ASML, and you can't sanction China from utilizing its own technology. So the United States can sit there and say what it likes, but it's all meaningless. It's all hot air, and in the process, they're going to cause damage to companies like Nvidia. And we're speculating a bit where this goes in the future and the developments, but that it could pose ongoing serious threats to companies like Nvidia, and it will just allow China to take a dominant position in the end. If this extrapolates how I would expect it to, I think in the next 5 to 10 years, China will dominate the semiconductor world, quite believably so. And I think that is going. The United States is going to have to sit down and reflect upon the fact if they just behaved in an adult, civilized way and hadn't hamstrung companies like Nvidia, the United States could have had the dominant position, just sold the technology to China. But instead, the US was terrified of doing this. It saw that China was making massive strides forward, thought it could put the kibosh on that and then of course it's completely failed, and in the process, not only is it handing the baton to China in terms of the ongoing race to produce semiconductor chips, they're increasingly more efficient, increasingly higher capability, but also it's deeply damaging the position that the Western companies had before all this idea we're going to destroy China entered into the consciousness of someone somewhere in the Beltway who frankly made an absolutely idiotic choice and decision to do that.
There's two final things I want to touch upon. One is absolutely vital, and the other is sort of anecdotal, but it does describe the mindset of China when it comes to technology, the future, and innovation. Chips aside, the fact of the matter is that they need vast amounts of whether Nvidia or whatever's coming out of China, they need vast amounts of these things to run the processing centers of the expected data centers for AI. It's going to require a vast amount of energy, and China is already so far ahead of the curve when it comes to that, whether it's the hydroelectric they're putting in, the solar arrays that they have uh, throughout the country. China has already prepared its grid and its energy for the AI expansion. The United States, they're having blackouts and grid failures on a constant basis every single year. We are not prepared. We can create all the technological advances that we want, but if we don't have the energy or the infrastructure to be able to run them, it's absolutely moot and meaningless. And lastly, the interesting thing that China, like I said, in innovation, let's take their EV industry. Where in the US we sell an EV car, we don't have enough charging stations to be able to facilitate a nationwide run out of EV cars. And when the EV cars fail, it's usually $10,000 to $20,000 or more to replace the batteries. That's usually the biggest point of failure. So what do they do in China now? Instead of building an entire nationwide charging system, they have almost like Jiffy Lube type garages where drivers can go in for 5 to 10 minutes and they swap out the batteries completely and they're fully charged and on the road. So they're doing that by the tens of thousands every single day. Think about the innovation. It's about finding solutions to a problem rather than trying to build upon an antiquated system. And really, that's going to be the line for the future. Any final thoughts you wanted to add to this, Paul?
Yeah, just briefly, this is just another example where the United States needs to learn to stop trying to inhibit China. It is never going to work, and in fact, all they're going to do in the process is hand the baton to China. They're going to give China more and more incentive to develop their own technology in this case, and they can do so rapidly. And at the end of the day, until the United States realizes it's win-win cooperation, China is just going to steamroller them all over the world, both domestically and internationally, because China will be able to corner markets. Because at the end of the day, their economies are not based on financialization. Their economies have a far lower cost matrix, and the United States cannot keep up with them in terms of production costs. And more importantly, the United States is now starting to suffer from the fact that huge amounts of Chinese scientists have all gone back to China because they don't want to stay there anymore, because they don't like how they're being treated, or because they just feel it's time to go home. They're being given incentives that they can't refuse, and that will be financial apart from as much as anything else. And the US needs to start realizing we need to cooperate with China and get a 50% slice of the pie, because at the end of the day, if they don't, they're going to get no percent of any pie, and it will just continue to see the demise of the United States because it thought in its stupidity that it could take on China and defeat it. That is an impossibility. It was an impossibility 10 years ago. It's even more of an impossibility, if that makes any sense, which I know it doesn't in one sense, but that's where we're at now. So, will someone in Washington finally learn the lesson? It's highly debatable because they're still making all the wrong noises. China will sit there and go fine, because in the end, they will just decouple from the United States in totality and have nothing to do with them. And they won't need them in any way, shape, or form either.
And I think that's the key thing right there. China, for all intents and purposes, no longer needs the United States, but the United States desperately needs China. Paul, as always, thank you for your insight regarding this topic.
Yeah, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, as always, thank you for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.